Hi, welcome back to Books for Thought. I'm really excited because for the month of February, we've got the dynamic and really fun Dr. Bryan Brazeau, who initially studied his undergraduate degree at Concordia University in Montreal. He later moved on to the famous NYU University, where he obtained his master's degree and his doctorate. And he's now an academic within the liberal arts faculty at the University of Warwick. Um, Bryan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
It's really exciting to have you here and to be able to have this conversation with you about liberal arts, because it's a degree that I think is a bit mysterious and elusive for a lot of our students and even for quite a few of the parents. So it's a really great opportunity for everyone to be able to discuss with you today why you think it's a great option and go into a bit more detail through the discussion of these books, what it's like to study this degree. So if you'd like, it'd be great if you could start off, telling us a bit about yourself and why you ended up studying liberal arts.
Yeah, certainly. So, myself, I was the first person in my family to go to university, and that can be a bit of a strange experience for students. I know when I was 16 or 17 and I was thinking about university, it seemed really scary. There were so many different options out there, and I didn't quite know what I want to do. I was in Montreal and I saw this great liberal arts program at Concordia University. And I said, "Isn't this interesting? This program doesn't focus on let's just train you as a psychologist, let's just train you as an economist. This program trains you to think about thinking. This program trains you to learn about what you love, to fall in love with something that you really want, and to give you the skills to learn more about that." So I said, I'll give this a shot. My parents were nervous. They had no idea where it was going to go. And in the first year in that program, I really fell in love with two authors. I fell in love with Dante and I fell in love with Cervantes. And I know for Spanish students, Cervantes is probably not the most popular, but when I was 16 or 17, reading Don Quixote for the first time was a revelation to me. So I then said, you know what? I'd really love to read these in the original because reading them in translation is just not the same. So I learned Italian, I learned Spanish. I set myself a goal that when I finished my undergrad degree, I would be able to read them in the original. And I did. And they were amazing. I loved them. And what I ended up doing was I said, I really love this stuff. I'd love to go and pursue a master's and PhD in Italian. So I applied. I had lots of teachers who really helped me. One of the things I loved about that program was it was very small and I was able to work with the tutors and the teachers one-on-one. And they helped me a lot in, thinking about what I wanted to do with my life and helping me develop these applications. And then I went to NYU where I did my master's and my PhD degree, looking at Dante and looking more at kind of Renaissance epic, looking at all kinds of different authors, and ended up, writing that. It was a massive project, but I was really proud when I finished it. And after that, I came over to the UK and I came over to the University of Warwick, where I was here for 2 years on a research contract. There, I was working on the reception of Aristotle and the Renaissance. I only got dorkier as time went on, but that happens to some of us. And then in 2017, I was really excited to join the liberal arts team here at Warwick. And the liberal arts program at Warwick, it started in 2016, so it's still a quite new program, but it's a really interesting program, and I'm really happy to say more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to know what you think makes that program at Warwick stand out and why it would be, a wonderful opportunity for a student thinking about this degree to also consider studying at the University of Warwick.
Yeah, so I would say there's a number of things that make us stand out. One of the biggest things is the fact that we're one of the only liberal arts programs in the UK that has dedicated academic faculty. Many times, liberal arts will borrow staff from different departments to say, oh, you come and teach this one class, you come and teach this class. But the students in that department don't feel like they have a home. Whereas here at Warwick, we have 4 staff who are all based in the department. We're all employed by liberal arts. We're all really passionate about liberal arts. And it's really nice because we have that sense of a small department. In a sense, what I love about being part of this department is I'm replicating the sort of undergraduate department I was in. That sense of a small department. We know all the students by name. We work with them individually. And we really have that personal touch. Students know us. We know them. And what we try and do in our department, what's different from other liberal arts degrees that you might see, is we really embed problem-based learning into all of our teaching. Now, you might be like, what is problem-based learning? This sounds really complicated. A good way to think about it is if you're familiar with IKEA. Many students go to IKEA, you've been to IKEA with your parents. At IKEA, you'll often buy something and you bring it home and you build it yourself. And psychologists have looked at this and they've actually said it's called the IKEA effect. Students, not students, but people who buy things at IKEA tend to value them so much more because they built them themselves than something they just bought from a store. And that's the animating strategy that really drives so much of our teaching. It drives the way that I teach my classes because I don't show up and say, here's knowledge, just take it, right? We give you the tools to kind of think through, well, wait a minute, how can I build this? In the same way you'd get something from IKEA and you have instructions, but everybody's going to build things slightly differently. Everyone's going to pick different things. That's what we try and do in our program. And we do that by looking at real world problems to get you to, grapple with them and recognize how complicated the world is. We don't tell you what to think. We teach you how to think, and then you choose where you want to go with that. That leads us to talking again about the structure of the department, right? It's really important to us that the department feels like a comfortable home base for students. We have a lounge that's dedicated just for our students and students in global sustainable development. And then within this home base, you have the ability to choose and build your own path. So our students will either choose a disciplinary path. So they'll say, I want to do liberal arts and history or liberal arts and economics or something. And that's fine. You can be based with us and you take more and more classes with those departments as time goes on. Or we have a lot of students who say, I really want to come up with my own degree. I want to come up with my own pathway. A good example of this is we have a student who's really passionate about opera. We don't have a music program at Warwick. Not a problem. The student's based with us in liberal arts, but that student is then taking classes in the French department to learn about French operas in the 19th century. The student's writing her final research project on operas in the early 20th century and how they were performed in the United States in certain concert halls. And we have these amazing, really students who just, find their own pathways through things. We try to help them and to coach them, but students determine their own pathways. And I think that's one of the things that I love about teaching in this program is no student is the same. No student is a number. We really love to see students develop, to learn about the world, and then to find something they're passionate about and to help give them the skills to develop that. I don't know if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
It does. It makes sense. And I think it's really important and useful. This is something that anyone who's interested in anything, this course is useful for them because it's giving them the tools that they need to be able to move forward successfully in whatever direction they choose to go afterwards. Right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think in terms of the types of courses we offer, in terms of the department, our core courses are usually, there's a lot of them in the first year, and slowly yet surely, students take more and more classes outside the department as they progress in the degree. So in the first year, we have classes like Art and Revolution, where you look at the links between art and different kinds of revolutions in history. I teach a class on science, society, and the media, where we look at how complicated it is to look at the relationship between science, the history of science, the way that's communicated in media. We spent 5 weeks this term just looking at COVID-19 and how it was conveyed in the news to get students to think critically about the world around them. Students do classes on sustainability and consumption in their second year, looking at these really key problems. And then we have a whole suite of really interesting optional modules that students can take. Some of the really fun ones that I teach, and I'll talk more about one of the books I teach in one of these today. I teach classes on underworlds, classes on paradises. We have classes on the quest. We have classes on apocalypse. We have classes on utopias. It's really fun. It's engaging, and it's quite rigorous as well. Our students tend to produce amazing research because we believe in them.
Yeah. And that's really important, isn't it? Giving them that confidence to go down the path that's the most exciting for them, because that's what's going to allow them later to figure out where to go and how to do it, and thinking
Yeah,
about their
exactly.
futures and having a successful as well as a happy,
That's right.
professional life.
And
So
we also have an employment officer who's a dedicated employability and placements officer in the department. We're one of the only departments at Warwick that has this. And this person works really closely with students to help them develop employability skills. If students want, they can do a 1-year work placement or summer work placements. And we know that liberal arts skills are really attractive to employers. Employers want people who can communicate effectively. They want people who can think critically. They don't want cookie cutter economists churned out by the same department. I mean, I love economics. I think think it's a fascinating field, but employers want people who can think for themselves, who can be strong, independent individuals who are able to go in and to really make a difference. That's the most important thing, really. And that's really what the liberal arts are all about, is thinking critically and learning how to make a difference and to affect positive change in the world.
There's the key, isn't it? It's the way to figure out, how we can be the most impactful in a positive way, not only for ourselves, but for the communities around us. Uh,
Yeah, exactly.
so it's actually really quite a beautiful thing to choose, apart from, fun and also interesting. Um, so moving into the books that we chose today to discuss a bit more liberal arts and how it works. Book one is In Defense of a Liberal Education, which was written by Fareed Zakaria, who's also quite well known. Apart from his books and his articles, he's got a program on CNN that quite a few people like to follow. Um, what is it about this book that you believe makes it an excellent read for students who are thinking about studying liberal arts at university?
Well, I think one of the things I really like about this book is that Zakaria combines his own experience with liberal education, with the broader history and sort of values that are embedded within a liberal education. He goes back and he looks at, for example, the founding of the University of Virginia and that curriculum by Thomas Jefferson. He looks at, Benjamin Franklin's setting of the curriculum for University of Pennsylvania, and this emphasis on learning across a wide variety of different disciplines, but putting all of that together to make people engaged citizens, and not just engaged citizens in the United States as we might think, but Zakaria really takes this and thinks about being a globally engaged citizen. And that's really important. I think that's what the liberal arts can do in the 21st century, is they can make us think about how we can combine knowledge from all of these different fields, from everything you're passionate about. Even if people say, oh, those things don't go together normally, why would you study, I don't know, theology and sociology or something? You can put all those things together in your own way to be an engaged citizen. And I think Zakaria really shows in this book not just how that is not something new, it's something that really has this long tradition, but he also plugs this into liberal arts programs in the 21st century, talking about different liberal arts programs in the world. The book came out the year before we launched our program. I'm sure if it had come out once we launched it, he would have talked about ours. But he talks about how this is a really important thing, not just globally, but also in terms of preserving democracy. If you care about democracy, if you care about democratic systems, and that's really the broader argument that this book makes, the liberal arts are essential to that. And there are political forces that are trying to sort of, push the liberal arts into a corner and say, oh, this is just ivory tower thinking, when it absolutely isn't. It's really a way of thinking that creates critical citizens, that creates citizens who think critically. Whatever your political persuasion is, it's a question of thinking about why you think the way you do, thinking about what matters to you, what you love, and how you can combine those skills and that knowledge to really be an engaged citizen that makes a change in the world as you want to define that kind of change.
Wow. So it's so inspiring. I'm listening to you talk about it right now, and just ready to get up and go and get started, and I'm sure that a lot of the students are thinking the same thing. And I'm also sure that the parents are also those who might be a little bit worried about liberal arts, that they're starting to get a better idea of what it's actually about, and all the benefits that it does provide for anyone who decides to go down that path. Thinking about this book and everything that it can provide for someone who's new to liberal arts, I'm also wondering what was it like for you to read this book, and what did it provide for you? So what did you learn, or how did you grow thanks to reading this book?
So I read this book when I was coming back from a conference in New Orleans, and I was coming back to the UK. This was at the point I think I was about to interview actually for this liberal arts job. The book had just come out, and I was really excited and nervous, and it really gave me that understanding of why I've been so passionate about liberal arts ever since I was an undergraduate. Right, what it is about these ideas that really make me excited, that really get me thinking, hey, this is something we need more of in the world. This is not something we need less of. And I think ultimately one of the things that I found really resonated with me about this book was the fact that the book it provides a gentle critique of what's known as instrumental reason. This idea of you just do something for something else, right? Why should you go to school? Why should you even go to university? What's the point? A lot of students will say, well, I'm just going to get the degree so I can get a job. And of course, that's important. But at the end of the day, the liberal arts are about more than that. They're not just about creating excellent, change makers in the world. They're also about finding some sort of deeper meaning, channeling that passion, channeling that love for different ideas. And when I read this book on the plane, I remember reading it and just thinking, this is exactly what I want to be doing. This is exactly the type of thing that I want to do. And it really just struck me as, this is such a valuable thing, not just for students, but it's a valuable thing for society. It's a really valuable thing to be able to, I think, create this space in which we can have these discussions, in which we can engage with the contemporary issues of the world around us, but also the rich and deep and complex traditions that inform those, right? Without necessarily letting those force a particular approach or deny certain voices. One of the key things about liberal arts in the 21st century is that with this idea of global citizenship, and Zakaria points this out, it opens up spaces for more people to have voices in these conversations. And that's so important, I think. So one of the things I love about the liberal arts, and one of the things I love about this book, is it empowers students. It empowers students to recognize that when they're part of a liberal arts program, when they're part of a program that emphasizes interdisciplinary learning and civic engagement, what they're doing is at the same time that they're looking at the world around them, they're also engaging in this rich 2,000-year-old tradition that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, in a really meaningful and important way.
Definitely, and it's creating that space for debate. It's creating that space for dialogue among opposing sides. And I think especially today in our society, it's really important that we are um, taking care of that space and making sure that we continue to have that ability to dialogue with people who maybe have a different view without moving towards hatred and just blind opposition. Really being open to hearing what the other people say in order
Absolutely.
to, confirm or deny what you previously believed.
Absolutely. And I think one of the great things that liberal arts can do, one of the things that this book shows, is that when you understand the values that motivate you, when you understand why you're so passionate about something, you're able to think critically about it. You're able to gain that self awareness to say, I'm really passionate about this cause and it means a lot to me. But because I know where my passion comes from, I've tapped into the source of it and I have the tools for making change. I don't feel as powerless. So I'm able to engage with the other side. I'm able to say, I might disagree with you, but we can disagree respectfully. And again, the liberal arts gives you the tools to do that, to be able to have those conversations, to be able to conduct research, to be able to think critically and to see things from multiple different perspectives.
Yeah, which is so important when we think about preserving democracy, when we think about just being able to maintain respect, a respectful attitude towards the other, so that they can have that same attitude towards us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think respect is the key word here, because I think quite often when we think about engaging with others, engaging with viewpoints that we disagree with, we think about things like tolerance, right? We think, oh, I'll just tolerate this. That's not enough. If someone says to you, I realize you're passionate about this, but I'm just going to tolerate it, that makes us feel horrible, right? What we want is respect and validation, and that sense that if we work together, even if we disagree, we can build something that's greater than ourselves. And I think that's such a key message right now in this political moment.
Definitely greater than ourselves and beneficial for all. No?
Absolutely.
Well, yes, fantastic.
I mean, I might add with this book, I think if students read this book, it's not that long a book. I think it's a really interesting read. I'd recommend parents have a look at it too. And if after reading this, students say, hey, I'm really interested in this, I want something else to read. What else can I think about? I might recommend students go back and have a look at the Odyssey by Homer. You might have read this in high school. You might have read bits and pieces of it. But if after learning about the liberal arts, you go back to this book and you start to think, well, what is this journey about? What is this journey, this homecoming about? What am I coming home to? And really, that's what the Odyssey is about, is this journey of education, this journey of learning about the world, and finding new ways to come home. And again, I say this because I'm teaching a class this term in liberal arts on homecoming. But I think it's really interesting to think of education education as a kind of homecoming, right? Can we think of education and university education as a way of coming home to ourselves, to that person we always wanted to be, to the person that we know we're going to be one day? So I would recommend, after reading this, if students want something else to read that's in the same vein, I think the Odyssey is a great place to go.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that search for self, or as probably Paul Auster, the author of our second book, No City of Glass, he might argue homecoming to the people, no, because he would probably say that we have no one fixed self, but many sort of versions, no, and I think that's something that we do start to see in his novel City of Glass, where we have, of course, the narrator, right, Quinn, but then he's got his pseudonym for what he writes under, Williams, and then we also have the character, Max, who's the detective in the novels that he writes. And as we go through the novel, we start seeing how they're actually connecting, no, and how sometimes Quinn is more in tune with Williams, or more in tune with Max. And well, I'm going a bit off on a tangent here, but yeah, let's jump into Paul Auster's book, City of Glass, which is
Yeah,
book number
certainly.
2, because I think it's not only is it just an interesting book in and of itself, no, and I'd like to hear from you, what it's about, when it was written, all of that great stuff, and also thinking about some of these really great, solid connections to other classic works that would form a part of a really solid liberal arts education that students could also think about
Yeah,
reading.
certainly. So, in thinking about City of Glass, it's important to note that we're talking about City of Glass, the graphic novel, which you can see here. City of Glass was originally written as a short novel in the New York trilogy, which is 3 short stories that Paul Auster wrote in the late 80s. And it was adapted into a graphic novel sometime later. And the graphic novel adaptation is really interesting. It's really engaging, especially to see how they translate such a complex work into a kind of graphical format. What the book is about is a really tough question. One way to put it is that it's a detective story about detective stories, if that makes sense. I always try and describe this to students because I teach this in my class on quests. I try and describe City of Glass to students as a self-destructing piece of fiction. It's a piece of fiction that, as you read it, comes apart in your hands until at the end you go, "Wait, I'm not. What just happened?" And in a sense, I think that's part of the perspective here, right? As you were saying, Allison, there's this sense of mirroring, this sense of, well, wait a minute. Okay, we start with a detective, but this detective actually writes detective novels. But then the detective is referred to as the author at one point. He's referred to as Paul Auster. He meets Paul Auster at one point. This is really confusing. What's going on? And as we start to unpick it, we get into this realm where we get completely disoriented, where we feel that we're in this space where we don't know what's going on. Many students read this and they love it, but they go, I don't know what just happened here. Right? But I think that's part of the point of this book. Part of the point that this book is trying to make, part of the point, both the novella and the graphic novel, it's looking at our search for meaning, right? It's looking at how do we find meaning in a postmodern world where everything seems so confusing and overwhelming? How do we find something that is meaningful for us, and how can we kind of activate that, right? And what I think is really interesting is when we think about this book references so many different stories, so many different authors. One of the clearest ones is Quinn, the main character. His first name is Daniel. It's DQ, which is a wink at Don Quixote, which we also have Paul Auster discussing in the middle of the book. And it's really interesting because the book has so many little clues that you feel like when you read it, you just need some sort of a key to put it together. You just need to find that thing that will make sense of it. And what's really interesting is Auster in interviews has talked about this book, and even the book itself gives you these keys, but it doesn't give you the keys you might want, because it talks about detective fiction and it talks about the idea of meaning being both everywhere and nowhere. So when you read a detective novel, if you like thrillers or even thriller movies and stuff, you watch these things, you pay attention to all the details, because at the end you're going to find something that you didn't observe, and that's going to make sense of the whole thing for you. And at the same time, you only figure out that meaning when you get to the end. So detective novels are constantly delaying meaning. And Auster's playing with this in this book. He's saying, Well, if that's the case and we find meaning everywhere and nowhere, isn't that so similar to our condition today? Where we're trying to search for meaning, where we're trying to find these little scraps, these fragments that we can put together. And we see that in the book with the character Stillman, who's walking around New York, and the detective's following him. And he says, oh, look, he's actually tracing out this really interesting, message in a way when he walks the streets. But then we find out that the message itself is meaningless. Right, which is really, really interesting. And one of the other myths that this book sort of refers back to is the idea of the Tower of Babel. Right. So when I teach this in my Quest class, I have students read. There's an Argentinian writer, Jorge Luis Borges, who I'm sure I'm not pronouncing correctly, but he has a fascinating short story called La Biblioteca de Babel, which is really very good. And I have students read that and then think about how to engage with that. This is a story about an infinite library that has everything. It has your own name in it. It has a book somewhere that tells you how you're going to die. It has a book somewhere that tells you who you will marry and everything. And somebody created a version of this online where you can go and you can search for any book in this infinite library. And it sounds amazing until you actually recognize that you cannot interpret any of these books. You can find your name in a ton of them. You can find different things, but it seems senseless. It seems like nonsense. And that really is our condition within this book, within City of Glass, is trying to figure out what's this key? What's the thing that's going to unlock everything? And one of the things that Oster said in interviews about New York Trilogy and about City of Glass is that the ambiguity is part of the premise of the book. The book is not supposed to give us some sort of clean ending, but it's supposed to make us question our own search for meaning, to question our own search of why is it that we constantly want these definite, clear meanings? And what happens when we do that? What happens when we try and fix something in a definite, clear space that it doesn't quite fit into? It starts to fall apart. It starts to not fit that space. The way that we create meaning in and of itself becomes a sort of auto fiction, if that makes sense. And I think that that's really the fact that it mirrors the reader within the text and it says you need to find your own path to create meaning through this text. Because most texts we read and we're told, if you understood the context of this, you would see that, for example, Cervantes was referring to this one thing and that's all. And of course, I think that's a terrible way to read Don Quixote. It's such a rich and wonderful book. But we're not talking about Cervantes today. We're talking about Paul Auster. And City of Glass is about a labyrinth. It's about a maze. It's about a maze that has so many different pathways through it. And it's about, in a sense, the pleasure of losing yourself in that maze to find your own way out. And I think that's really important. I think, we constantly expect just this clear, straight path ahead. And then when we're confronted with obstacles, we don't know what to do. City of Glass throws you into this kind of maze where you can either feel lost and frustrated, or you can really enjoy the pleasure of discovering your own route through it. And for me, I think that really embodies what a liberal arts education is all about. It's about looking at the world around us. It's about looking at the world in its complexity, in its ambiguity, not simplifying things for a textbook, not simplifying things for a classroom, but diving in headfirst to how complicated the world can really be. And then finding our own ways through that. Not finding solutions, not necessarily finding answers, but learning to ask better questions, learning to think more critically about these things, and ultimately learning the path that we want to take, which is going to be different for every single person in liberal arts and every single reader of this book as well.
Yeah, and I think it also um, foments a higher level of comfort with gray areas, like you're saying, the ambiguity. He makes reference at one point, to the idea of to what extent are people going to put up with blatant lies. I think he says blasphemies, no, and he says to any extent, no, because truth can also be relative, and I think becoming comfortable with the fact that we need to navigate this world, finding the truths that work for us and learning how to deal with those gray areas and learning how to really decipher everything that's around us so that it works for us and not necessarily looking for the truth that works for everyone, because that doesn't really exist. No, I think that's a really interesting thing that he plays with throughout the story, and something
Yeah.
that we see in a lot of other works as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I think I like the fact that you use the word deciphering, right? Because I think this is something we're always looking for this. When we read the news, when we look around the world, we want just that one key to make sense of things. And I think what I love about this book is that it shows you that in the act of deciphering, in the act of trying to make sense, we're simultaneously creating meaning. We're simultaneously creating new ciphers. And that sense of deciphering is not just passive interpretation, but it's actually an act of creation. It's an act of creating our own sense of not our own truths in a way, but our own ways of approaching truth, and truth with a small t, not a capital T. This doesn't mean that we all can't connect, but when we recognize that that activity is unique for each individual, that we're all both deciphering and reciphering all the time, we can then appreciate others' perspectives so much more. Because we say, we're not saying, I have the truth and you don't. We're saying the truth is out there, but it's slippery, it's elusive. Let's all try and come at this with our different skills, our different ways of seeing things, and let's understand that when we're doing this, we're also creating something new. And I think one of the things I love about this book is it blurs the boundaries between reality and fiction, right? When you end, you kind of go, well, wait a minute, what just happened? Where am I? Where's this? What's going on here? Right? It plays with all these different levels. And for students, I mean, if you've seen Inception, this is a bit like Inception, but in a book. And what's interesting is I think what Auster's doing here is not new. It seems postmodern. It seems so complicated. Cervantes was doing this throughout Don Quixote. And that's part of the fun. And it's one of the reasons that I think for me, literature is so powerful because it can play not just with the sense of, oh, let's imagine these fantasy realms, but it plays with our very act of creation, right? What does it mean to create something? What does it mean to tell a story? What does it mean to think creatively? And I think literature can really validate that, not just in a fantasy realm, but show us how important that is in the real world in which we exist now.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's that idea of a book is not just about the characters in the story necessarily. It's also about how that book is joining into the conversation in terms of literary works and how those literary works are really mirroring life and creating a dialogue between the world we live in and what we're reading through literature, which is
Yeah,
something that can be very, very enriching. Um,
absolutely. And I think one of the things I love about this book, and that I love about Paul Auster's books in general, is that they show you that if you start to change the way that you approach the world, if you start to question your own perspectives, you start to see things differently. And in this book, a good example of that is someone like Quinn, who starts to question different things, and then all of a sudden begins to see the homeless population in New York, who have always been invisible to him. And he suddenly sees how these people exist on the margins. They exist in other parts of society. They've created their own pathways through things, and he recognizes the injustice of that. He recognizes how problematic that is. And again, for me, I think that really mirrors what liberal arts education does. It lets you see new perspectives. It lets you see things in a new way and to determine your own ways of kind of engaging with that. And I think for me, the book is really resonant because when I first read it, I was an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, I had a bit of a strange job outside of school. I worked as a police dispatcher at 911, or I guess that would be 112 in Spain. And I would, work overnight. I don't need much sleep, so I would just, stay up really late. And if you could stay awake between 3 and 5 in the morning, it was fantastic because you got paid to read books, which was lovely. So I remember, I mean, that's when I read Don Quixote. That's when I read Paul Auster, and I remember reading this and just thinking, this is so strange. At the same time that I was, answering calls, dealing with real life serious events, I was also reflecting on the relationship between those hard realities of the world and the possibilities of fiction, the possibility of engaging and seeing things from new perspectives. That job was really interesting for me because it let me see a cross section of society that I never would have seen before, where you speak to anyone and everyone, where you're exposed to all kinds of different things, both things that are absolutely very funny and things that are absolutely horrifying. But it lets you see that whole sort of broad experience of the world. And I think Auster really tries to do that as well, to say we need to get out of our own boxes. We need to think more broadly. We need to try to see society, our world, our history in a really complex way, because the world is complex, and reducing that complexity just leads to problems.
it does. It does. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for your time today and for having this discussion with me. I'm sure that people who were considering liberal arts have a much better idea of it now, and I'm sure that people who weren't are now considering it. I think we can consider in some ways this discussion something that might possibly end up happening in the classroom as well. No, the way that you can start maybe at one point and end up somewhere totally different, but at every point you're just discovering and learning and getting a better idea of the world around you. Um, so if you've got any final recommendations for students in terms of other books you think they might be interested in reading, let
Oh
me
gosh,
know, and I'll
sure.
make sure to include those in the blog post. And for our viewers, if you've got any particular questions for Bryan after this post, do feel free to let me know, and I'll be in touch with him, and then we'll get those answers out to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. We'll see you next month, viewers. Bye.